They will tell you it was an accident, a slip of wet asphalt, a bad night, a wrong turn taken at the wrong speed. They will tell you love was present, that panic followed, the grief came later. But accidents don't rehearse. They don't leave patterns. And they don't whisper instructions long before the body hits the ground. And what you're about to hear was buried under police reports, sanitized timelines, and a boyfriend's trembling voice that sounded almost convincing if you didn't listen too closely. Because when you slow it down, when you strip away the comforting language, something else emerges. Not chaos. Intention. And it begins like so many American stories do. A young woman trying to steady her life. A relationship that looked normal from the outside. Photos, smiles, shared routines. No bruises visible. No neighbors calling 911. Just a quiet tension that never made it into words. The kind that sinks into walls, into text messages deleted too quickly, into phone calls ended just before someone says the wrong thing. And on the night she died, the boyfriend told police she slipped. He said the rain made the road slick. He said she lost her footing near the embankment. He said he tried to grab her, but it all happened so fast. His story arrived fully formed, like something memorized. The same phrasing, the same order, grief delivered in clean sentences. But investigators have learned to distrust clean stories, and they noticed the pauses. The way his eyes searched the room before answering, the details he volunteered without being asked, and the ones he never mentioned at all. They found inconsistencies small enough to ignore if you wanted peace, large enough to matter if you wanted truth. And truth is rarely loud. It doesn't scream. It waits. It lets people talk themselves into corners, and by the time the police returned to the scene in daylight, the ground told a different story. The marks didn't match the fall. The distance didn't match the force. And the phone, her phone, held a final record of fear that never made it into his version. And this wasn't an accident unraveling. And it was a plan beginning to show its seams. And the second time police walked the stretch of road, they did it slowly. Not as first responders, but as readers. Every inch of ground became a sentence. Every scuff a punctuation mark. And what the land described did not align with panic. It suggested positioning. And the boyfriend said she slipped forward. The marks showed backward drag. He said she lost balance near the edge. The soil showed she had been standing still, not running, not stumbling, waiting. And then there was the timing. He claimed he called for help immediately, but the call logs revealed silence, minutes that stretched too long, enough time for thought, enough time to decide what story would live and what truth would die. And investigators began looking backward, not forward. They searched the weeks before her death the way archaeologists sift through ash. Text messages recovered from cloud backups. Notes from friends who remembered arguments that felt heavier than normal. A coworker who recalled her asking, quietly, what happens if someone falls? But no one believes it was an accident, and the relationship, once framed as ordinary, began to fracture under pressure. Financial stress, control disguised as concern, a pattern of isolation that never crossed into obvious abuse, but hovered just below it, the most dangerous kind. The kind that leaves no bruises but rewrites your sense of reality. And police also noticed something else. In his interviews, grief never evolved. Shock stayed frozen. The same tears fell at the same moments. Real mourning shifts. It deepens, cracks, mutates. Rehearsed emotion remains unchanged. And then there was the search history and late nights. Questions typed and deleted. How far is fatal? Can a fall look accidental? Average response time, rural roads. He said he loved her, and maybe he did in the way some people love control more than breath. And when confronted, he denied everything. Said investigators were twisting coincidence into cruelty. Said they were turning tragedy into theater. But the evidence wasn't performing, and it was accumulating. And then somewhere in that quiet pile of facts, a truth was forming. One that could no longer be pushed over an edge and forgotten. And by the third week, the case stopped being about what happened that night and started becoming about who he had been long before it. Police pulled apart his past the way you peel old wallpaper, expecting nothing and finding stains underneath. And there were previous relationships, not violent on paper, no charges, no headlines, just women who described the same feeling using different words. Pressure, guilt, the sense that disagreement came with consequences. One former partner remembered how he would rehearse arguments out loud, practicing calm explanations for things that hadn't happened yet. Another recalled how he always seemed to know where she was, even when she hadn't told him. And none of it was illegal. All of it was telling, and investigators returned again to the final hours before her death. Gas station footage showed them arguing in the car. No audio, just gestures. His hands sharp and controlled, hers restless, defensive. At one point, she turned her face away from him and stared forward, jaw clenched, the way people do when they realize a conversation is no longer safe. And then came the phone data. Her step counter spiked sharply at the location where he claimed she slipped, then stopped suddenly. No chaotic movement, no stumble, just motion then nothing. Her last message, sent to a friend earlier that evening, reads simply, "If something happens, it wasn't an accident." And he said she was emotional. He said she was dramatic. He said she'd been drinking, but toxicology came back clean. No alcohol, no drugs, just fear. And when police brought him back in, they changed tactics. No accusations, no raised voices, just silence. They let him talk, and in that quiet, he filled the room with contradictions. He corrected himself too often, added details that complicated his own story, tried to sound helpful while slowly digging deeper, and the accident narrative began to collapse under its own weight. And because accidents don't require this much explanation. And what finally broke the case wasn't a confession. It was patience. And detectives stopped chasing his words and started mapping his behavior. The routes he took that night. The choices he made when no one was watching. The way he positioned himself in every version of the story as the only witness, the only survivor, the only narrator left to define what she became. And they reconstructed the scene with forensic analysts, not to dramatize it, but to strip it bare. Gravity, distance, body mechanics. The physics of a fall don't care about excuses, and the math refused to cooperate with his story, and where her body was found required force, not a slip, not a misstep, a push, deliberate and directional. Someone had to be standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, applying exactly the wrong kind of pressure. And police also noticed something subtle in his emergency call. Not what he said, but what he didn't. He never used her name, not once. People in shock repeat names like prayers. They anchor themselves to them. He spoke instead in abstractions. My girlfriend. Distance disguised as composure. And when investigators presented him with the new findings, his demeanor shifted. Not anger, not despair, irritation. As if the story he'd worked so hard to build was being unfairly criticized. As if reality itself was being unreasonable. And that's when they told him about the charges and second-degree murder. Planned, aggravated. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears. His face didn't crumble, it recalibrated, like someone adjusting to a new set of rules. And later, alone in the interrogation room, he asked one question. Not about her, not about her family, not about what he'd taken from the world. And he asked how long the trial would take. And in that moment, the final layer peeled away. What remained wasn't panic or regret. It was calculation. And the trial unfolded the way slow truths always do, without spectacle, without mercy. Each day added weight. Each witness brought the room closer to something no one wanted to name out loud. This wasn't a moment of rage. It was a sequence, a rehearsal performed quietly over time, and prosecutors laid out the planning not as a checklist, but as a pattern. The searches, the route selection, the choice of a place where darkness erased witnesses and distance delayed help. They showed how love had been used as camouflage, how trust became the final weapon. Jurors watched, silent as messages were read aloud, messages where affection sat uncomfortably close to control, where concern blurred into ownership, and the defense argued doubt. They always do. They suggested coincidence, misinterpretation, a system eager to blame. But doubt weakens when repetition appears, and repetition was everywhere. The same behaviors, the same phrases, the same emotional flatness when confronted with irreversible loss. And her family sat behind the prosecution. They didn't cry loudly. They didn't interrupt. They listened. And sometimes that was worse. Because grief, when it's been living with you long enough, doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it just watches, and one expert witness described the fall in clinical terms. Angles, velocity, force. It was unbearable in its precision. The kind of truth that leaves no room for stories, no room for maybe. The jurors took notes, pen scratching softly, as if afraid to disturb what was being revealed. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And when the verdict came, it arrived without drama. Guilty. The word landed and stayed there. Heavy, permanent. He showed no reaction, no tears, no collapse. Just a stillness that suggested he had already rehearsed this ending too. But endings in cases like this are an illusion. And because the truth doesn't stop at the sentence, it follows the living home. And after the cameras left and the courtroom emptied, the story did what it always does in America. It scattered into online threads, into whispered conversations, into the quiet spaces where families try to rebuild without the person who should still be there. And her parents returned to a house that still held her voice in the walls. Her clothes still folded the way she left them. Her room unchanged, not as a shrine, but as a refusal to accept the lie that time is supposed to make this easier. They learned quickly that justice doesn't heal. It only names what happened. The rest is carried. And in prison, he began writing letters, not apologies, Explanations, long, carefully structured narratives that reframed events, softened intent, and repositioned himself as misunderstood. He spoke of pressure, of stress, of love gone wrong. He never wrote her name. And psychologists who later reviewed the case noted something chilling. He didn't see the act as violence. He saw it as a solution, a way to end a problem without appearing to be the kind of man who solves problems that way. In his mind, the accident wasn't just a cover story. It was the version of himself he needed the world to accept. And that's the quiet horror buried beneath this case, and not the fall, not the push, but the way planning can wear the mask of normalcy. How someone can sit across from you at dinner, memorize your fears, learn your trust, and quietly calculate how to erase you without looking like a villain. And across the country, similar cases sit unsolved, labeled accidents, misfortune, bad luck. Some of them are exactly that. Others are waiting for someone to read the ground the way police finally did here. Slowly, patiently, without needing the story to be comforting, and because the most dangerous lies are the ones that sound reasonable, and the most disturbing truths are the ones that almost worked. And somewhere in the archives of American justice, this case now rests as a closed file, evidence cataloged, verdict recorded, a name entered into databases that will outlive everyone who spoke it aloud. On paper, it is finished. But stories like this don't end when the cell door closes, and they live on in the small decisions people make when they choose whether to stay, whether to trust, whether to ignore the unease that settles quietly in the chest. They live in the moments when someone says, "I was probably nothing," and decides not to look closer. And because what this case truly exposed wasn't just a murderer, it exposed how easily violence can hide inside routine, how planning doesn't always look like scheming, and danger doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it whispers reassurance, sometimes it smiles in photographs, sometimes it says, "I'll take care of everything," and means it, and she is remembered now in fragments. A laugh caught in an old video, a sentence in a yearbook, a final message that refused to be silenced. She didn't know she would become evidence. She didn't know her fear would one day teach strangers how to see. But maybe that's the final truth buried beneath this story. And that the past isn't just something we study. It's something that warns. Quietly. Relentlessly asking to be noticed before it repeats itself again in another town. On another road, beneath another carefully rehearsed explanation. And they called it an accident. And the ground said otherwise. And if there's one lesson carried forward from this forgotten corner of American horror, it's this: when a story feels too clean, too practiced, too convenient, listen harder. The truth is usually still there, waiting beneath the surface, patient as history, and far more dangerous when ignored.